This drawing is a great way for you to practice some perspective skills as well as develop your landscape drawing know-how as well. It'll take about 25 minutes. I'd love to draw with you, so let's dive in. We're going to start off by adding 2 lines, like the sloping sides of our valley. One on the right side and one a little bit farther up on the page on the left side. Now, these really kind of frame in the middle of our page, because often when artists draw landscapes, especially ones farther away like this, it can be easy to not think about composition and not think about the way that we draw people into our scene and the elements that we need to make our scene appear three-dimensional. If we pretend that there's a horizon line up here on the top of our page, that means we're pretending that this is the curvature of the earth, and if there was nothing else in the way, this is where objects would disappear over the curve of the earth. That gives us a valuable clue as to where to add the lines to the bottom of our mountains and our valleys as we draw this valley scene. If I know that the vanishing point, is going to be right up here, that means I want to create my lines that generally fall on a line that points up towards this vanishing point. If I add in a guiding line with pencil, you can see how I want the lines to generally go towards that vanishing point on the horizon line. This does not mean, however, that the sides of our valley have to be flat. We can have some fun with how we create them. They just have to generally be going in that direction. Here's what I mean. We can make the side of this mountain kind of go in on the left-hand side, and then draw another little valley that comes out and comes back in again. You can see how the dominant points of our valley kind of follow that general line, kind of moving back towards the horizon line and that vanishing point. The same can be said on this side. However, we can also add some lines kind of more in the middle. And so if I had another little rocky outcropping here that juts down towards the middle of our page, continue that line back. And draw some jagged outcroppings downward. You'll see that this still appears to be drawn in perspective, even though the lines of the valley don't form a straight line right up towards the vanishing point. However, this is when we can start having fun with filling in the rest of the valley, because even though the horizon line is here, we don't have to really keep it in the frame. I'm going to add some more lines with some points that fall along that line that I drew there, that curve upwards, and maybe a line that goes almost straight across the page. You'll notice when I'm drawing the tops of these mountains, I'm really trying not to draw a lot of straight lines. Even though mountains are jagged and can appear up and down, there's some imperceptible tiny little wiggles in the way that our eyes perceive them, and you want to replicate that with pen. And that's good news, because it means that we don't have to worry about getting everything right or drawing every line straight. I've drawn this little outcropping here, and now we can add some nice little mountains in the background. Some curving lines that go up. You notice I'm not drawing many vertical lines here, because especially this far away, very few mountains have noticeable huge towering vertical segments. Most of them are on that kind of curving slope, curving up towards the peak. You can really keep going farther back as we draw more mountains. I'm gonna add a peak to this mountain here, and maybe I'll do another one here as well. We have a lovely little mountain valley now. What I'm going to start to do is adding some detail to really give it character and flesh out this three-dimensional space. First, I'm adding a little bit of trees here down at the very bottom of the valley because, as you know, trees don't really grow up at the tops of these mountains. They're down closer to the sections in the middle, the valleys running through these rocky peaks. Because these trees are farther away from us, we're not going to see much texture on them. So I'm going over with a nice hatching layer here. And just like I added the side of a mountain as we went down the valley, I'm adding some little lines that slope upwards to kind of show that the trees might kind of undulate out and inward as well as they kind of follow the curves of the mountains. Now, right now this looks like a scribble, but as we add more detail to the mountains themselves, I believe it'll make more sense and look more like trees as well. We're gonna add more trees down here too, making sure that the top of them is that kind of more of a fluffy, organic shape. And they're a little bit closer to us, so I'm gonna add some texture, some little squiggles that are kind of curved, and shading in them as well. Now in the middle of this valley, I think it'd be great to put a river. I love drawing rivers, and I love looking at them too. I'm making it kind of hug the side of our cliff face, and I'm starting it out really small. As it gets closer towards us, it's getting larger. Now, rivers are hard to draw in perspective. These curving lines can be kind of tricky, but you'll notice how on each corner or each edge of the river, I'm flaring out the line a little bit. So at the apex of the corner, it's almost level on the page to the interior angle of the corner. What I mean is you can see that this corner here is on this level of the page. The external angle of the corner is here rather than up here. Let's see what that would look like. So if I drew this river down here, and the curve was here. If I drew the curve up here, that's how you get a bend in the river that doesn't really look like it's correct in perspective. Instead, if we're drawing the curve of the river like this, we want to draw the outside curve horizontal with the apex of the curve. It's hard to explain why this one doesn't look right, but you'll likely understand when you look at it. Right here, it looks like we're looking at a river over top, from the sky. But this one, it's more like the river is kind of extending into the distance. From here, we can add some more trees. And what I love about drawing in perspective is that these trees kind of obscure parts of the river. The objects we draw have an impact on the other objects in our scene. Adding some more shading here, and these trees are closer to us, so I want to add a little bit more texture to the trees themselves, kind of creating that bushy line, maybe doing some evergreen trees as well. The beauty of pen drawing is that nothing has to be neat and tidy. I love how these drawings can be kind of messy. The squiggles can be a little bit random, but it can often still look really good and really effective at kind of conveying the mood or the atmosphere of the scene we're trying to draw. You'll notice the trees closer to us are also a little bit more bushy, a little bushier and a little bit darker as well. As objects kind of recede into the distance, they appear lighter to our eyes. We really want to capture that in what we're drawing here today. And we know that the river is not flat, meaning that riverbanks kind of go up on the sides. There's a slope kind of leading into the river, right? To help kind of illustrate that, it can be really effective to add some really small little lines that kind of curve downward. You know, the lines on the right-hand side kind of curve down from the right, and from the left-hand side, they curve down from the left. The more vertical the lines are, the sharper it appears that the riverbank is. We still want to kind of fade these out, make them lighter, less perceptible as they recede back. You know, before we start working on the rocks themselves and the cliff faces, why don't we add a few more clues about the landscape we're drawing? You know, in these flat areas, I love to think about how farm fields would kind of come into play. And farm fields are really fun too because they're uneven and somewhat irregular shapes that are really interesting to draw and kind of add some dynamism to the landscape. You know, medieval farming, agriculture, and fields was not as huge or clean cut as fields are today. You can kind of experiment with what that might look like when we're drawing fields on the side of our river. You know, you'll notice that a lot of these lines also kind of mirror the shapes that we've already drawn. And so they might be a little bit easier to draw in perspective. Farming fields also are, you know, uneven size-wise as well, so you can kind of have some fun with drawing different sizes of fields. And add some three-dimensionality by drawing some trees in between these fields as well. You know, at this point, since we're so far away, the trees we're drawing are almost just squiggles. On the field closest to us, I'm going to add a little bit of texture here, really, really light up and down lines to kind of infer that there's some corn rows here. And now I want to start with the rocks themselves. Now keep in mind that these rocks and cliff faces are far away, so there's not a lot of detail we actually need to add. However, we're going to focus on texture and shading here. When I think of rocks, I like to add vertical lines that kind of mirror the edges that we've drawn, but give us opportunity to add our own shading. Here's what I mean. Dotting this line out here, like that, and then hatching off that line, and hatching off this line, and then adding some diverging lines that kind of angle in different directions. What we're doing is basically hatching in some shadows to show that these rocks are three-dimensional. They have different shapes, different surfaces that the light reflects off in different ways. By adding some up and down areas of hatching and then kind of scriggling over them with some more vertical up and down lines, we're starting to create a sense of scale and the texture of the rocks as well. But this is all based on vertical lines up and downward that allow us to kind of draw in these textures. Experimenting with adding some darker lines and darker sections can be really effective as well, because when you look at a mountain face and a cliff face, you'll notice that there are areas of darker shadow and areas of lighter highlights. The ideal drawing, I believe, has a full spectrum of lights and darks, and it's important that we try to capture that here. On the other side, you can experiment with some different ways of adding texture to the cliff faces, but I love to kind of continue to base that off the up and down lines that are still organic, still lyrical and kind of curving, but are hinging off the up and down motion. Bisecting some of these lines with darker areas of shading can be a really great way of adding some interest and more detail to our scene. You'll see how I'm kind of outlining some of those areas of shading with my pen and creating lines that kind of go through those areas as well, adding darker shading, and really drawing rocks, especially in all texture, is really a exercise in finding your own style, finding what works for you. It's hard to describe, why you place lines where you do, and especially in this case where I'm drawing so many lines, it's difficult to assess exactly why and where you place the lines on the page. However, it's great that it gives you the opportunity to find out, your style and how you perceive the shapes and objects you're drawing. It gives you clues to how you can draw them and what textures kind of stick out to you. For me, the contrast between light and dark when I'm drawing rocks is really key, and that's what I focus on when I'm drawing them. I'm also fading out the textures as I kind of go up the page and making sure that they get lighter and less detailed as we kind of voyage back farther into the scene. If we pretend that the sun is coming from the left-hand side of the page, that means we can start to darken in the right-hand side of these rocks and cliff faces so that they cast a shadow down below. The shadows are really what gives life and three-dimensionality to our drawings, and that's really true when we're drawing big, expansive landscapes like this. So if the sun's coming from over the mountains to the left, I'm making sure that the cliff faces that face away from the sun are going to get the most shadow. This can also mean that we add some shading down to the trees too. Another layer of hatching that kind of roughly mirrors the height of the mountain face above it. And I think that the shadows really make the highlights kind of stand out even more. The same thing can be done with this mountain face to the left here. can see how even though I'm adding a layer of hatching on top of the details I've drawn, they still kind of show through, meaning that even though we've done some detail work that we're covering up, the stuff underneath is still visible. I'm going to extend some of the shading over the river itself. And add a last little bit of detail to the cliff face that's closest to us. You notice as this cliff face is closer, I'm spending a little bit more time adding some smaller details with those lines kind of cutting the rocks in half. Often when we're doing big landscapes like this, it's great to have some objects in the foreground that kind of show the scale of our drawing and kind of place the viewer in the scene as well. To do that, let's add a little layer of trees here at the foreground of our drawing. These are going to be larger and hopefully kind of give the sense that we're looking down from maybe a cliff ourselves. I'm going to kind of layer in some of these trees so it appears like they're kind of going downhill here too. As we fade these out, I'm making them more imperceptible, smaller, smaller, smaller. And maybe I'll just add a little bit of shading here behind them to kind of give the sense that these trees kind of lead downhill into a more natural forest here, right on the edge of our fields and forests and river. Here we have a really basic landscape scene of a mountain valley with a river running through it and some fields to the side as well. Now I've gone over the high level stuff, the main ideas in this drawing, but you could spend so much more time adding so many more details, and I hope you do. I hope you keep drawing. I'd love to see you back in my tutorials, and as always, you can find me on Skillshare for more full-length deep dive drawing lessons as well. Thanks so much for watching.